Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast graciously donated by Podbean.com. Podbean, thousands of podcasts to start your own today.
And now, from Stockton, California, you can't spell teacher without T, even though he's not a big tea drinker. Here is Mr. Hauger.
All right. That was quite a lot, considering we don't usually do sponsored introductions. But let's get started. Welcome to a special edition of the Hauger History Podcast, day after Christmas 2016. Happy holidays, everybody out there. Hope you're enjoying your family, friends, and whatever traditions that you celebrate around the world. In a multicultural listening environment, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mr. Hauger, and this is the Hauger History Podcast. Today we're going to talk about 5 big questions about the Renaissance that are probably going to be on your upcoming assessment or chapter test. And if you're in my class, that probably turns into more like 100% type figure. In fact, probably essentially 100%. Anyways, let's not worry about whether you're not in my class. And let's worry about whether or not we know what we're talking about when it comes to the origins of the Renaissance, the Italian essence of the Renaissance, and how it spread across the world, and why people sometimes debate in historical provinces and principles how important the Renaissance was or how significant it was, and whether or not the movement actually trickled down to people like you and me on the street, or whether it was only significant for the people who were innovating and becoming well-known and the people that we study today. Let's talk about how the reopening of the Silk Roads affected Europe first and foremost to get us started and put some perspective on our conversation. It's interesting and commonly read in most textbooks about how the Silk Road that had been partially blocked for many years and was insecure for transporting goods since around the 8th century is reopened by the Mongol conquest of the 13th century, and how this trade route to and from China connected Europe with the empires of the East and made it possible to transport goods and, in effect, cultural diffusion. Remember that spreading of ideas, the fact that we weren't going to go hundreds of miles and just trade our goods and money and leave, that we're going to share ideas, religion, faith, innovations. Those are combinations of innovations and inventions. I think I just invented that. But the trade with the Tang and Song dynasties was minimal, and the frequent raids on caravans made it a big problem. But when different empires in different areas made their trade routes more stable, we suddenly saw the Mongols advance westward and subdued nearly all of Asia under the Great Khan. And they even went so far as Constantinople and the Holy Roman Empire. Now we have a connection for the whole length of the Silk Road. And this relatively political balance between the Khanates let passage and prestige of trade routes grow and become safer. Now goods were flowing from China to Europe and from Europe to China. Don't forget that that goes two ways. And so this is a huge commercial revolution. And historians note from 1000 to 1300 that the Silk Road contributed to a larger process that would bring a lot of economic changes and would allow then people to stop having to farm and to work and to labor and begin to start to think and develop social, demographic, agricultural, and economic changes and improvements. Remember, people have to be freed up and not have to look for water and food all day. Remember back to the first day of our class and podcast. So this would ultimately lead to the Renaissance that we know today and that which we study. From whatever textbook you read, you're no doubt going to be given some kind of a basis of political geography. Europe during the 1300s to the 1600s will give you kind of a foundation on 2 crucial periods, the Renaissance first and then the Reformation. Much of the power that was going on and controlled in Europe from this period lie in 3 major areas: the city-states of Italy, the Papal States, and the Holy Roman Empire. During the years that we're talking about, Italy was not a unified country. It was a collection of large self-governing cities. We call them city-states often in our classes, and their surrounding communities and farms. From the 1300s to the 1600s, several of these independent city-states prospered. You'll know the names today. Florence, Venice, and Milan were huge in power and influence. Mostly during the increase of trade and banking, they were able to centralize wealth and control it. And life was beginning to change too. So don't think it was just economics, which has approximately 2 more syllables. And that's a sign of the Renaissance, bringing in so much more that I can't even pronounce it with the normal amount of syllables. At least I put the wrong emphasis on it. Anyways, moving on. To the north of the Papal States, you had the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, King Charlemagne made Christianity the language and the rule and the religious right of the land and starts taking down everyone who wasn't Christian, but it was a huge change and shift in the beliefs and the power of the Pope and the Church. So during and toward the end of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance began. It's a French word that means rebirth. If that comes up on your test, French word Renaissance means rebirth. Historians use the word to talk about classical art often, and even the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. And although there was no sudden end to the Middle Ages, it wasn't like there was a big festival and the Renaissance had begun, people's lives were changing over time. The church was telling people to think more about life after death and less about their daily life on earth. This brought a whole thoughtful era to this situation. And I don't think sitting alone and being thoughtfully reflective is enough to really capture the Renaissance. I think you have to take it part and parcel, in hand with the increase of trade and commerce, and that cities were starting to grow larger, but not just bigger, they were growing wealthier. Newly wealthy merchants, traders, and bankers were able to support the growth of arts and learning. There was an excess of wealth, and there was a renewed interest in the cultures of the ancient worlds that we studied in 6th and 7th grade, and that started just a whole deluge of new ideas. Greeks and Romans inspired new styles of architecture. They had new approaches to art and even the ways of thinking and analyzing and appreciating past art. So this led to the philosophy that we'll talk about called humanism, and that's really kind of a placing a value in the skills and the good creation of all individuals, right? Humanism, the skills of humans. It balances this kind of religious faith with also the power of the human mind, and that we start to acknowledge ourselves and appreciate ourselves. I mean, take a look at the NBA after they make a basket. That's kind of the idea. Look how great we are. Sorry to take a swipe there, Steph. Humanists took a fresh interest in human society and the natural world. This thinking contributed to the burst of creativity during the Renaissance period. So we've gone through one question, which was how did the Silk Roads impact? And it just played a huge amount of, now you've got a whole millions of new buyers for your goods, and vice versa. You're going to get more goods in, more trade, more wealth, more ability to sponsor people's creative arts. And it was almost like a sign of power and prestige if you were able to bring in artists. And it was a sign of your grace and your greatness as a person to let these wonderful workers come in and do their thing. So speaking of art, let's talk specifically, and we don't do this a whole lot through the year, at Renaissance paintings. The big thing about them is that they looked more realistic and proportional and human than earlier works. And the question is why? Why did many Renaissance paintings look more realistic than earlier works? Part of the reason was that the art of the Renaissance was based upon classical art of the Greeks and Romans from 500 BCE to 500 CE, about 1,000 years of valuing balance and harmony there. People draped in togas, robes, or nude, and people looking like they were in motion, believable faces, but calm and without emotion. The Renaissance was a rebirth, right? And if we just think about what that word means, a giving of new life, illuminating manuscripts, paintings, sculptures, windows. To teach people about religion was kind of the statement of art in the medieval phrase, to educate people about the scenes and the fantastic nature of the Bible and the grandness of it. But people were serious and showed little expression. Paint colors were bright. Again, focus. What would rebirth mean then? Well, now figures were shown in action. They were showing real people doing everyday tasks. Faces were expressive. There was feeling. Colors were warm and were responding to light in the picture. And there were still religious scenes, but there were also, for the first time, non-religious scenes. It was reflecting a great interest in nature, more three-dimensional sights, and an increasing knowledge of anatomy and science. So there's just a lot more background and perspective that has depth in it. Renaissance painters and sculptors tried to show people as lifelike and engaging in passion activities or everyday activities, but capturing their real-world essence. So that is a great response to answer the question of in what ways or why did many paintings look more realistic? It was a reflection of humanism. Like, I want to see what people look like and portray them as they are and look at the greatness or even the color of them or the expressions on their faces. So that's just a glimpse, and you can check out so much more Renaissance painting. In fact, if you want to go up and beyond is probably not the optimal phrase. I bet above and beyond is something that's spoken more commonly by people. But if you wanted to look at Renaissance painting and artists, you could do what I'm doing right now, is you either hear the keyboard and just do a simple web search and see what kind of people you come up with. You'll know the names, especially for us at our private school environment. We know Michelangelo and Raphael, but look further. Look at Botticello, Angelico, Piero della Francesca. There's so many, Giorgione. So, I mean, go and do a deep dive. Enjoy it and turn in something, and we'll give you some points. At least I would if I was your teacher. Why would I not want you to go do some work? Find something that interests you, that passions you. Have a rebirth of homework. Okay, you're like roaning in there, Mr. Hauger. Again, not another word, roan. I don't think so. How did cities play a role? Question 3. In spreading Renaissance ideas. Cities had wealth. Cities had money. If you are an artist, you need to eat, you need to survive, and often painting consumed you. Sculpting took up your time and days. Doing this art was not cheap. You needed supplies, you needed support, and you needed usually a sponsor. So cities had sponsorships and wealthy patrons that could supply you with this art. Then if you get famous, they would get some commission or notoriety or fame along with you. So cities were the place in which arts could be supportive. And not too dissimilar when we look today to Oakland and San Francisco and Berkeley in the Bay Area. These cities where artist communities lie. And they are a significant part of our culture. Even if they won't be celebrated until later on, they will be. And they are capturing the period of the day and the sentiment of the now, just like Renaissance artists were back then. Question 4. Name and explain the significance of one advance in art and one advance in science during the Renaissance. So I think we've covered art, but let's talk about science. Leonardo da Vinci, one of the greatest guys in history. I know calling him a great guy kind of seems like I'm recommending him to go out on a date, but that's not what I'm talking about here. In 1624, one of so many things that he did, he designed the original submarine. And so many things he designed he couldn't come to fruition with in his lifetime. But in 1624, Cornelius van Drebbel actually put one underwater, was able to go 15 feet under the surface. Basically, it was a rowboat made from wood and fitted with air tubes. Would I want to be the first volunteer? I would not. Was not asked, but that's okay. And alchemy was considered witchcraft during the time, but it was a study of materials transmutating through obscure processes, basically taking nature and turning essential substances into cures and different materials that could be constructed into another surfaces. It was used to process metals like lead to gold, and it was working with elements like mercury, sulfur, and even other alchemists used plants and created new substances and new combinations of chemicals, basically early chemistry. The microscope was invented in 1590 by Jacarius Janssen. The microscopes used lens glasses to magnify what you see, and of course you already knew that, but you might not have known they came from so back far ago. It's amazing for me to always think that these people were pondering what they could do and used what they had at the time. I could barely hang up my clothes without getting wrinkles in them. Astronomy, Galileo Galilei believed that the sun did not revolve around the earth, the heliocentric theory, but in fact that the earth was a satellite of the sun along with many other planets. Galileo was told to keep his mouth shut by the church, and they did not have a great relationship for quite a while. So not everyone at the time was welcomed with their ideas, especially those that were thinking. The barometer was invented in 1643 by Evangelista Torricelli. This changed the height of mercury and showed you how much pressure there was in the atmosphere. He was also the first person to create a sustained vacuum. Pretty cool. I bet his house was clean. Not that kind of vacuum, Mr. Hauger. Medicine and anatomy. Medical treatments and medicine itself were upgraded during this time in a big way. There were less amputation, leeches, and less torturous procedures like just lop an arm when you had a little blemish. Human dissection was introduced at the same time, and the first steps of understanding the human brain were taken at the time. Remember, this is a time where people were looking inside the body and seeing how things worked, and then that was reflected in art and culture and the future advances in science as well. How about mathematicians? William Augereau invented the slide rule in 1624. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I didn't have a way to measure it. Dun-dun-dun. The slide rule was based on logarithmic scales and made it possible for mathematicians to perform calculations a lot more easily. There's so many we could talk about. Exploration, the Columbian Exchange, European expansion, but science really, really prospered at the time too. So that's quite a few examples to think about. And number 5, what were 2 effects of the printing press on European society? Books could now be printed. Ideas could be shared easily. People could spend less time copying. You could trade books with other countries. You could translate things into languages. You could popularize theories from one culture to another. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. But this one has melted. This Hauger History Podcast has gone on long enough for one rebirthing day. They're like, can you stop talk about rebirth now? And I will. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at Hauger History. Subscribe to us on iTunes. The Hauger History Podcast is free and hopefully will help you prepare for your studies or just a refresher course for all my adult friends out there, of which there are few. All right, let's end it on that note. We'll see you on the next edition. And thank you, 7th graders, for listening. Push in your chairs, check your floors, and we'll see you next time.